Right, so I'm giving the presentation today, but this paper was co-written with Simon Buckingham Shum, who's sitting at the front here. He's going to come up at the end, wrap up anything that I've missed out, and help me with answering questions. So this is definitely a double-hander. Don't look at it and think it's all down to me. So I'd like to give you some context for our interest in social learning analytics. We come from the Open University in the United Kingdom, which is a distance learning university, which many of you may know. We've currently got 250,000 students. But on top of that, we've got 1.5 million alumni. And our alumni aren't quite like everybody else's alumni, because at any point they may become students again. At any point, they might think, we'd like to do another Open University course, and they may come back. And in fact, some of our students have been studying with us for 40 years now. They came in at the beginning, and they like it so much they've stayed. So we've got a long tail there. We've also got a long tail informally. We've got a lot of things up on iTunes, and we've had 50 million downloads on iTunes. We've got 1 million subscribers on iTunes. We've had 600,000 views on YouTube. We co-produce programmes with the BBC, which a lot of people have seen. You might have seen Frozen Planet, things like that. So we've got an even longer tail there, stretching out learners across the world. Not all our learners, even our formal learners, are in the UK. We've got 16,000 learners outside the UK. So we've got a real data bank out there, and we've got a whole load of learners that we're thinking, how can we best support them? How can we keep on supporting them? And one of the ways we're doing this is the Social Learn project, which Simon and I have been working on for several years now, which is developing a social media space tuned for learning. So we've got an LMS, or as we call it, a VLE. We've got a Moodle, where all the formal learning takes place. But we need something to support the informal learning, the times between the formal learning, the things that are going on in the background, the interest-based learning. And I've got a completely blank slide. What's happened there? Okay, why have all my slides gone blank? I can see the next one, but I can't get to it. There we go. Right, it's all right, don't worry. Don't know what happened there. So when it comes to analytics, the OU is well placed in terms of learning analytics, because we've been doing learning analytics for about 40 years now. We've had data on students coming in. My department at the Open University, which is the Institute of Educational Technology, has been looking at the data all through that time. We've been looking at retention, we've been looking at success, we've been looking at indicators that students are in risk. We've been giving feedback to course teams. We've been doing that for 40 years. We've got a track record of research, and we've got a lot of data because we've had a lot of students. So a lot of researchers at our university are interested in taking it to the next level. Okay, been there, done that, what can we do next? And we see a new challenge because we see a new environment out there. This is a couple of slides from the Shift Happens video, which probably all of you have seen at some point. That's been out there for 5 years now. And we're currently preparing our students for jobs that don't exist yet, using technologies that have not yet been invented. Now, this is a shift in models. We don't just have content experts now. We can't just model current practice. We need to be preparing our learners for a world that doesn't yet exist, and we don't quite know how it's going to shape up. So we've got to adopt to that sort of educational landscape. We've got to give them the skills to engage with that. So social learning analytics is focusing on how students build knowledge together. And we're looking at it in the context, at the moment, of online social learning. So it's formal and informal learning, and it's networks and it's communities. And we're interested in how can individuals learn more in social contexts. But we're also interested in how can these groups function more effectively to support learning. And when we talk about groups, we're not just talking about the courses and the cohorts of formal education, because we're interested in those, but we're also interested in the networks, the communities, and what James Porgy calls affinity groups. So why social learning analytics at the moment? We think there's a number of drivers behind this. One of the things is we've got this ubiquitous social media now, through which a lot of learning is taking place. So I've put up just some of the tools that I've been using to support my informal learning at the moment. I use Twitter a lot. I use Facebook less. I probably use Google Plus even less, but they're out there and people are using them for learning. But most of this is off the radar for formal education. What do we do with this information? Can we tie into that in any way? So social learning analytics, we're hoping, could provide tools to support learning in these situations. It could support reflection on our interpersonal relationships and interactions, even when we haven't got a tutor around, even when we haven't got a mentor around, even when we're not on a formal course. And we've also got a lot of free and open content out there. I mean, the Open University has been one of the leaders in getting open material up on the internet. But people are doing this all over the place. There is a huge amount of open educational resources. And there's a huge amount of information out there which isn't designated as educational. How do we help learners to navigate that huge deluge of information, to find the things they need, and to evaluate what they're seeing? So I put up there just a tiny snippet from a hashtag community on Twitter, the PhD chat hashtag community. And you can see that in just 4 tweets, they're sharing new ideas. They've got helpful information. They've got useful resources. They're providing a support network. So how can we support the role of social networks in filtering and recommending resources like this? It's become a bit of a cliche to say we're now living in the knowledge age in which the key wealth-generating resource is now knowledge. It's not anymore land or labour or capital. It's now knowledge and has been since 1991. We don't know which knowledge is going to be useful in the future, but we do have an idea about the skills. And people keep trying to formulate these in terms of 20th century skills, 21st century skills, knowledge age skills. I put a couple of the frameworks up there, but there's lots and lots of them out there. So how do we support learners to assess progress in terms of these skills? And we know that these skills involve things like collaboration, communication, evaluation of relationships, that sort of thing. Another reason for social learning analytics, a growth in post-materialist values. A world survey of countries is giving this covered 43 societies, represented 70% of the world's population, and it showed a shift away from hierarchy, authority, conformity, towards autonomy and diversity. So shifting cultural values, how do we support that with learning analytics? And finally, we've got a theoretical framework. We're coming from a socio-cultural background, and that informs all our thinking about learning and about analytics. Now, one of the key aspects of that is that we believe that knowledge is constructed through dialogue. We don't see it as a model where it's transferred from the teacher to the learner. We see that as being constructed. So I've got a screenshot here from Learning Analytics course, one of the MOOCs. There's Dragan up there. He's introducing resources. He's sharing information. He's got a presentation up there. But the learning isn't just going on there. The learning's going on in the chat stream on the left. How can we support that sort of learning? How can we support the dialogues which are putting together effective learning? And also from a socio-cultural point of view, we know we're using tools to develop knowledge, and we know we're doing it in a cultural setting. How do we support that? So my screenshot here is from a conference I went to a couple of years ago, and this is just my screenshot, what I had up on the time. I was in a room with a lot of face-to-face learners, but also I'd got a web page up. I was looking at the reference that the speaker was talking about. I'd got the Twitter stream up, and I'd also got the live stream up. And around the room here, probably you've all got equally complex screens up at the moment. You're not doing one thing at a time. You're using a lot of tools to understand what's going on. How can we use learning analytics to support that? So I'm going to talk today about 5 approaches to learning analytics. These are the approaches that we're working with at the moment. And we're not claiming to reinvent the wheel here. We're drawing on a lot of people's research. We're pulling strands together from a lot of places. And we feel there are 2 sorts of analytics which are relevant here. Firstly, the ones which are obviously social. I mean, social network analytics, the clue's in the name. Discourse analytics, we don't have a lot of discourse unless you're interacting. But also socialised analytics, analytics which you wouldn't necessarily think of as social, but they've got social aspects to them. And we're thinking about how can we draw attention to those social aspects. The content analytics, disposition analytics, and context analytics. So I'm going to go through those 5 sorts of analytics fairly quickly. I'm going to give you an introduction to what we think can be done with them, and then an overview of how we are trying to develop them at the moment at the Open University on the Social Learn platform and with other researchers at the Open University. So social network analytics is probably the most obvious. That's the one we've heard about most at this conference, I think. And that gives us the opportunity to identify the learners, the individuals who support my learning, and people with relevant interests. And people with relevant interests aren't necessarily the people with the same interests, because we're interested in learning relationships. We're interested in expanding people's horizons. We're not interested in an echo chamber. We're interested in people with different ideas as well as the same ideas. And possibly identifying the origins of conflicts. Where have challenges arisen from? Are those challenges being addressed? Do we think those are good challenges? Can we build on those? And those are perhaps from the individual perspective, but also from the group perspective. What sort of groupings support learning? Can we provide feedback to groups as wholes and say, if you changed in this way, we think you'd be more effective learners? So the way that we're addressing this at the moment on the Social Learn project is we have an intern, Bieke, who's over there, working with us from the Open University of Netherlands. She, Martin and Chris, who are all at the conference, have developed a network awareness tool, which they've been using in a primarily face-to-face context up to now, to expose interest groups and relationships, and to help people to understand those and to improve them for learning. We're interested in putting that onto the Social Learn platform and in helping groups to find each other. Now, Social Learn's only been running for a couple of weeks with students at the moment, so we've only got a couple of thousand students. But if we scale that up to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, how do people find each other? How do they find people with relevant interests? How do we filter the resources on the platform? If there are thousands of people, how do you find the ones to support your learning? So we're highlighting the relationships between the individuals and the groupings that wouldn't otherwise be evident. So that's something that Bieke's just started working on. We're quite excited to see how that will develop. Discourse analytics. Discourse is the other analytic form which we feel is primarily social. And we're coming at this from a socio-cultural perspective of learners engaging in dialogue. That shows how they're engaging with the ideas of others, how they relate the ideas to their current understanding, how they explain their point of view. And we've been working with the work of Professor Neil Mercer, who used to be at the Open University, is now at the University of Cambridge. He identified 3 sorts of dialogue which can take place in a learning situation. Disputational dialogue, where we take 2 different perspectives, and one goes, I say A, I say B, nobody shifts, nothing happens, we just disagree, tit for tat. Cumulative dialogue, where I come up with a statement and you say, yeah, that's great, Rebecca, yes. And everyone around the room says, yes, that's great, Rebecca. It doesn't really move us on. You know, it's fine in a learning context. A lot of learning happens that way, but it's not ideal. So we think that what happens in an educational context, what educators are looking for, is the exploratory dialogue, the dialogue which involves challenge and counter-challenge, which involves evaluation of points of view, extension of points of view, and reasoning. So we're interested in analytics which can encourage learners to engage in those forms of dialogue. So once again, we've got an intern working on this. We've got an intern who's come in from the University of Hong Kong. He's working with semantic analysis and machine-based learning. And we're looking at the moment at Illuminate chat and seeing if we can pick out where challenge, reason, evaluation and extension might happen. And then this is a mock-up of how that sort of analytic might appear. So this isn't a black box analytic. When you're dealing with all the various social factors, I don't think it does to be a black box analytic. It's saying, this seems to be what's happening. You seem to have engaged in reasoning, evaluation, extension, and you haven't engaged so much in challenges. So you've got green squares to show you're doing a lot of that. You've got a yellow circle to say perhaps you're not doing as much, and here's some ideas about how you might develop that in future. So it's encouraging reflection, and it's also giving you some ways of moving on in the future. Content analytics. Now, I'd like to say here, that this isn't content analysis. I know we've got a lot of experts in content analysis here, people who've worked with this a lot. Content analytics, we're talking about automated methods to examine, index, and filter online media assets. And these can be used to provide recommendations. Now, this is a socialized analytic because you can see it doesn't necessarily involve any sort of social approach. And we're thinking that when those resources are connected with ratings, with recommendations, with comments, when they've been enriched by social interaction, then those recommendations are that much more powerful. So there's two approaches that are happening at the Open University here that I'd like to talk to you about. The first one, the screen on the top left needs a little bit of description. That's a page from the BBC website. It could be any website. At the bottom is an early iteration of the Social Learn toolbar, which you can take with you to any website. And work by Suzanne Little at the Open University on visual similarity analysis has picked up all the images which are on that page. So the sort of turquoise box is a list of the images on the page. And it then compares those with images in a database, and it can say where it's found those in the database. And they don't need to be the same size, they don't need to be the same proportions, but if it's the same image, her tools can pick that up, and then it can say, I see you're interested in this subject. Did you know that this information also occurs in this YouTube video, because it can do it in video as well? It appears in this course material. So that's one approach that's being taken at the moment. Another very different approach is in iSpot, which I don't think Doug Clow's in the room, but Doug Clow, who's here, is working with iSpot. It's a resource put out by the Open University. You can put up a picture of any living thing which you have spotted out there. It can be a fungus, it can be a bear, it can be a fish, it can be an insect. And you can say, what is this? And within an hour or two, somebody within the community will have come back and said, I think it is whatever. Now, obviously, visual similarity analysis could help us to do that. It could say, well, I've trawled through the database and it looks to me like it's a monarch butterfly. Where the social aspect comes in is where you begin to rate those recommendations and give feedback on those recommendations and say, it might look like a monarch butterfly, but in fact it's not, it's this other thing. Which takes us into another area which Doug is beginning to explore at the moment, about if people give different views to the software, and if they give different views to each other, how do we know who to trust? So that ties into reputation. How do you begin to establish reputation? How do you build reputation into the analytics? If we've established that somebody is an expert in butterflies in the UK, will they actually be an expert in the butterflies of Canada? If they're an expert in butterflies, will they know anything about ladybirds or fish? How do you differentiate? So there's a whole social aspect around reputation going on there. Disposition analytics. This is another approach which we believe is socialised. It doesn't necessarily have to be social, but there is a social dynamic to it. I'm not going to go too much into dispositions here because Simon and Ruth Deakin-Crick gave a very good talk on them the other day. I've put up the title slide there, which you can access on Simon's SlideShare account. Or if you ask him for the reference, he'll give you the reference. I'm sure he's tweeting it at this moment. I can see him typing. But dispositions is a way of rendering visible the mixture of experience and motivation and intelligence that make up your capacity for lifelong learning. And this isn't like learning styles where you say that's the sort of learner you are and you're always like this. This is the sort of thing that you can shift, that you can learn to improve your approaches to learning. So 2 approaches to this. The first one on the left there, my learning dispositions. I'm going to have to rush now. Right. My learning dispositions is how it's represented at the moment at the LE Spider for a mentored conversation. On the right there is a mock-up of work we've got an intern working on of, at the moment, it's a self-report generated. How could we generate that report from interactions on the social media site? And how can we then feed that into a mentored conversation? I was talking about mentoring analytics yesterday. So the social dynamic there is about the mentored conversation and about the importance of learning relationships within disposition analytics. Context analytics. I'm beginning to rush now because I've only got 5 minutes. 2 approaches to context analytics here. One about what is the learner's context. Are you in a formal setting? Are you in an informal setting? Are you learning over a long period of time, or are you doing something very focused? That's one approach. Another approach, which came out of the Mobile Learn project, with which Mike Sharples at the OU was one of the leading people, sees context as a dynamic process. So a mobile device can give you options related to your learning. So if you're walking down the street, it can say, I know you're interested in the history of Canada. Did you know that if you go 100 metres in that direction, you'll find some resources about that? You're interested in coastal erosion. If you caught the bus here, you could go and see some examples of it in action. Now, I haven't done very much on this at the moment because we're waiting to get the base platform of Social Learn firmly in place. But this is a mock-up of how this sort of thing could work. An app that you might put on your Android device or on your iPhone device. You can type any learning interest in, and you could say, for example, I'm sitting on an aeroplane, I've got 15 minutes to spare, I'd like to learn something about the history of Vancouver, because that's where I'm going. And it could give you the resources which are in the Social Learn system associated with that. But not just recommendations, recommendations which are based on ratings, which are to do with how people have commented on these, how people have engaged with these resources. So it's a socialised analytic. It's not just an algorithm. There are people involved in it, and it shifts according to what people are doing with it. So very, very quickly, how do we present all this to the learners and to the teachers? We think there ought to be different dashboard views depending on your context. Are you a group leader? Would you like to see what your group's doing? Are you a group member? Are you a learner? Are you a teacher? And there's a lot of analytics there. How can you present them in ways which make sense very easily to the learner? Can you set them up so that the learner can switch them off and switch them on? So we haven't done much on dashboards at the moment. This is an area in which we're seeking funding at the moment because we're very interested in not only how can you develop these analytics, but how can you present them usably to your learners and to your group leaders. So our take-home message here, we believe that online social learning is redefining the learning landscape. So the role for learning analytics here is to enhance the process, and we think it's key that this builds on theories of effective learning, that this isn't data-driven, this has got real theory behind it, and it's got real research behind it. We've shown you 5 classes here of social learning analytics to spark your thinking about the analytics you're working with. What would it mean to interpret those in a social context? How would that change things for you? And we've also told you about Social Learn, the platform we're working on, which provides us with a platform to test these ideas. So I'm going to ask Simon now to come up, pick up on anything that he thinks I've missed out, and then we'll be able to take questions.
No, that was a perfect presentation.
Do we have time for questions? If anyone wants to step up to the mic.
Don't get scared. Since I've been asking everybody that theory question all along, I just want to say that I thought this was very, very interesting with respect to the way that you're using theory to, and the point that you made about the theory being necessary to do these things. And A lot of food for thought. Thank you.
I must admit that in part this presentation was driven by your questions, so you've had an input there.
Hi, Rebecca. Thanks for that. That was a really great presentation. I've just, it's more a comment, and I'm just wondering, if we're getting all this kind of information and presenting it from different contexts, do you think there might be a question of overload for students and how they actually effectively use these kind of dashboards and widgets? And if you have any thoughts in that area, or, I mean, it's possibly too early to say, but just...
Yes, we could completely overload people. We also know that people are pretty good at continuous partial attention. But we also know that the so-called, whatever we call them now, generation X, Y, Z, net generation, born digital natives, blah, blah, don't necessarily have very good reflective critical faculties with the online world. And that's partly what we're trying to do here. So yeah, there's an information design challenge. There's a question about how people are monitoring these things and what they do with them. So this for us is it's a question about literacy, right? It's not. We've talked about the problems that educators may have in trying to make sense of these things when they're getting their educator dashboard. Equally, learners are going to be, if we're presenting them with more than just red, amber, green, but quite rich qualitative, representations. They've got to learn how to read those things. But that's just all part of what the evolution of learning will be as we evolve the environment.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I was thinking about what would be the effects of these analytics, right? I mean, going back to something like visual programming languages, they make a distinction between tool talk and domain talk. How much are they talking about the tools that are scaffolding the learning processes versus the domain talk, whether it's algorithms or principles of programming languages and so on. And we also know from scientific modeling and science visualization that the issue of transfer is also important, right? I mean, sometimes you show these nice simulations and animations to students and all they get from it is oxygen atoms are blue and hydrogen are white and stuff like that, right? So there is an issue of, there are conceptual issues here, there are questions of transfer, and how do you see those playing out when these kinds of analytics are shown?
Okay, well, I thought oxygen was always blue, right? So, no, I mean, look, these are maps, right? What is a map? A map is a systematic way of distorting the world for a particular purpose, right? Don't mistake a map for the territory. So, these are new kinds of representations. I mean, anyone who's grown up looking at gaming environments knows that they get all sorts of feedback and stuff. So, I guess I'm not unduly worried about that per se. It's the same challenge. These are just new kinds of maps for reflecting on knowledge and reflecting on your own process.
Just one, but that analogy assumes that maps have a correspondence, right? Maps are made with a particular projection, Mercator or whatever, so they correspond to, a good map has to have some correspondence to reality, but here's that's the issue here, right? What is the domain correspondence from these analytics to what are they corresponding to the conceptual domains? That's at least where I was getting at, right? So that's
an important question. I mean, you can't put a map in front of somebody if they don't know what the territory is, right? I think Kati was emphasizing that yesterday. She spends a huge amount of time working with people, normal people, not, information visualization researchers, trying to understand what it takes to get something up and running and embedded in their daily work practice. And they have to have an understanding of what they're looking at through this particular lens. What we're arguing here is that the world that we are designing for is one where students and educators have got to have new languages for thinking about what it means to be successful. So this picks up yesterday on the challenge around the difference between learning and deep learning and course completion or dropout or passing the test. These are new criteria for what it means to be a good learner.
I think also there's the socialised aspect to this, that we're not treating it as a black box, that when you see the analytic, we would hope you'd be able to drill down and see something of what's behind that representation, and also to engage with it. We see a possibility for having analytics that you can rate those analytics, so that can feed back into the design process.